The rockets left their pods in pairs, streaking across the Afghan valley with trails of white smoke that carved lines through the dust-choked air. 2 kilometers away, a Mujahideen convoy scattered as the first salvo impacted, transforming trucks and ammunition crates into fireballs that sent shockwaves rippling across the mountainside. The Mil Mi-24 Hind banked hard left, its stub wings loaded with rocket pods and anti-tank missiles, its nose-mounted 23mm cannon already traversing toward the next target. The helicopter's twin Isotov turboshaft engines roared at maximum power, pushing the 13-ton gunship to speeds that no Western attack helicopter could match. This was 1984, the Hindu Kush Mountains. Soviet forces had been fighting in Afghanistan for 5 years, and the Hind had become the weapon that Mujahideen fighters feared more than jets, more than artillery, more than tanks. When the distinctive sound of those twin engines echoed through mountain valleys, resistance fighters knew they had seconds to find cover or die. The Hind could appear without warning, moving at over 200 miles per hour, absorbing ground fire that would destroy any other helicopter, delivering firepower that could level entire villages. 6,000 miles away, in NATO intelligence centers, analysts watched footage of Hind operations, with expressions that had evolved from amusement to concern to something approaching dread. American pilots who had seen early photographs of the Mi-24 in the 1970s had laughed at its ungainly appearance, its massive fuselage that looked more like a flying armoured personnel carrier than a helicopter. They called it the flying bus, the flying infantry fighting vehicle, a design so fundamentally flawed that it couldn't possibly work in combat. Soviet helicopter doctrine, they believed, was backwards, trying to make one aircraft do too many things, compromising performance in pursuit of impossible versatility. Then the combat reports started arriving. Hinds engaging and destroying fixed-wing aircraft. Hinds surviving direct hits from heavy machine guns and continuing their missions. Hinds operating in conditions that would ground Western helicopters. Hinds changing the fundamental nature of close air support and armoured warfare. The laughter stopped. The re-evaluation began. And Western helicopter designers realized they had completely misunderstood what the Soviets had created. The Mi-24's origin lay in Soviet military doctrine that emerged from World War II experiences. Soviet commanders had learned that helicopters could transport troops quickly, but were vulnerable to ground fire. Attack helicopters could provide close air support, but couldn't transport the infantry needed to exploit the attacks. What if one aircraft could do both? Transport a full squad of assault troops to a hot landing zone while providing its own fire support and suppressing enemy positions? The concept seemed logical to Soviet planners. To Western analysts, it seemed like trying to make a single vehicle serve as both a tank and a troop transport, compromising the effectiveness of both roles. Mil Design Bureau, led by Mikhail Mil, began development in the late 1960s with specifications that seemed contradictory. The helicopter needed to carry 8 fully equipped soldiers in its cargo compartment. It needed stub wings to mount weapons. It needed armor protection against ground fire up to 12.7 millimeters. It needed speed exceeding 300 kilometers per hour. It needed to operate in extreme climates from Arctic cold to desert heat. Each requirement added weight, and helicopters are unforgiving of excess weight. Every kilogram reduces performance, increases fuel consumption, limits maneuverability. The solution was radical engineering. Twin Isotov TV3117 turboshaft engines, each producing 2,200 horsepower, gave the Hind power-to-weight ratios that compensated for its mass. Titanium armor, lighter than steel but equally protective, encased the cockpit and vital systems. The 5-blade main rotor, 17 meters in diameter, provided lift efficiency that allowed the aircraft to carry its weapons load and still maintain speed. The tandem cockpit put the weapons operator in front with optimal visibility, the pilot behind, and elevated for better situational awareness. Stub wings provided aerodynamic lift at high speeds, offloading the rotor and allowing faster forward flight than pure helicopter designs could achieve. The weapon's load was unprecedented. 4 underwing hardpoints could carry 57mm or 80mm rocket pods, 82 Swatter anti-tank missiles, or even bombs. The nose-mounted USPU-24 turret housed a 4-barrel, 12.7mm Yakushev-Borzov machine gun, later upgraded to a twin-barrel 23mm GSH-23L cannon. The weapons operator controlled all offensive systems through a sophisticated fire control system that included laser range finding and ballistic computers. For its era, the Mi-24 was as heavily armed as many ground attack jets. Western intelligence first observed the Mi-24 in 1972, designated Mi-24A. Initial assessments were dismissive. The helicopter was too large, too heavy, too complex. Its dual role would compromise both transport and attack capabilities. American helicopter doctrine had evolved differently, with specialized aircraft for specific roles. The UH-1 Huey transported troops. The AH-1 Cobra provided attack support. Trying to combine both functions in one airframe seemed like typical Soviet emphasis on quantity over quality, building one adequate aircraft instead of 2 excellent ones. NATO designated the helicopter Hind, following their tradition of giving Soviet aircraft names starting with H for helicopters. The name, chosen partly for its aggressive connotation, proved more appropriate than NATO analysts initially realized. As production variants appeared, each with improvements, Western assessment evolved from dismissal to respect. The Mi-24D introduced the distinctive tandem cockpit that gave the Hind its predatory appearance. The Mi-24V added the AT-6 spiral anti-tank missile with radio command guidance. Each variant addressed weaknesses and enhanced capabilities. The first combat employment came not in Afghanistan, but in Africa and the Middle East, where Soviet client states used Hinds in various conflicts. Ethiopian forces used Mi-24s against Eritrean separatists. Libyan forces employed them in Chad. Syrian Hinds operated in Lebanon. These early deployments provided combat data that Soviet designers used to refine the aircraft, but they didn't fully demonstrate its capabilities because the opposition lacked sophisticated air defenses or modern weapons. Afghanistan changed everything. On December 27, 1979, Soviet Spetsnaz forces launched Operation Storm 333, the assault on Taj Beg Palace that killed Afghan President Hafizullah Amin and installed a Soviet-friendly government. Mi-24 helicopters provided crucial fire support, suppressing palace defenses while assault teams moved into position. The operation demonstrated the Hind's effectiveness in a role Western helicopters had never attempted: direct assault support in urban combat against fortified positions. As Soviet forces expanded their presence in Afghanistan, the Hind became the primary close air support platform. Soviet doctrine in Afghanistan relied on helicopters because fixed-wing aircraft couldn't operate effectively in the mountainous terrain. Jets could bomb suspected enemy positions but couldn't provide the persistent presence that ground forces needed. The Hind could loiter over battlefields, respond to threats immediately, follow retreating enemy forces through valleys, and land to evacuate wounded or resupply forward units. Mujahideen fighters quickly learned to fear the Hind above all other Soviet weapons. Its armor could withstand hits from 12.7mm DSHK heavy machine guns that were the most powerful anti-aircraft weapons the resistance possessed in the early 1980s. Its speed meant it could appear without warning, attack, and withdraw before effective response. Its firepower could destroy entire villages, obliterate cave positions, annihilate convoys. The psychological impact was enormous. The sound of approaching Hinds caused panic that no other weapon could generate. Soviet tactics evolved to maximize the Hind's capabilities. Formations of 4 to 8 helicopters would conduct search and destroy missions, working in pairs with one helicopter providing covering fire while the other attacked. They developed tactics for valley flying, using terrain masking to approach targets undetected, then popping up to attack from unexpected angles. They used the cargo compartment to insert Spetsnaz teams directly into combat zones, the ultimate demonstration of the Hind's dual-role capability. The effectiveness was statistically dramatic. In 1984, Soviet aviation conducted over 40,000 helicopter sorties in Afghanistan, the majority by Mi-24s. They claimed destruction of thousands of Mujahideen positions, vehicles, and fortifications. More significantly, Soviet ground forces developed dependence on helicopter support, calling in Hinds for close air support the way Western forces called in jets. The Hind had become the Soviet equivalent of the A-10 Warthog, the aerial platform that ground forces trusted to provide accurate, immediate, devastating fire support. Western intelligence agencies monitored Hind operations intensively, trying to understand how an aircraft they had dismissed was proving so effective. The CIA obtained detailed information about Hind vulnerabilities through Mujahideen reports, and eventually through examination of captured or crashed examples. What they discovered forced complete re-evaluation of helicopter doctrine. The Hind wasn't compromising transport and attack roles. It was synergizing them, using capabilities of both to create something more effective than either alone. The armor protection was far better than Western analysts had calculated. The titanium cockpit tub could withstand direct hits from 12.7mm rounds at typical engagement ranges. The rotor blades were armored and could survive multiple hits. The self-sealing fuel tanks prevented catastrophic fires from fuel system damage. The redundant flight control systems meant the helicopter could continue flying even with significant damage. Western attack helicopters, designed for speed and agility, sacrificed protection. The Hind sacrificed some agility to become nearly unkillable by infantry weapons. The speed was revolutionary. At 335 km/h maximum speed, the Hind was faster than the AH-1 Cobra, faster than the planned AH-64 Apache, faster than any attack helicopter Western forces operated. This speed came from the stub wings, which provided aerodynamic lift at high forward speeds, offloading the main rotor and allowing the engines to drive the helicopter forward, rather than simply maintaining altitude. Western helicopters achieved all lift from their rotors, which limited forward speed, because advancing rotor blades eventually approached supersonic speeds, while retreating blades lost lift. The weapons load exceeded Western attack helicopter capabilities. A fully loaded Hind could carry 1,500 kilograms of external stores, including anti-tank missiles with 4-kilometer range, rocket pods with 128 rounds of 57mm or 32 rounds of 80mm rockets, and the internal cannon with 750 rounds. The fire control system, while primitive by Western standards, was adequate for the mission profile. Soviet tactics emphasized volume of fire over precision, saturating areas rather than hitting specific points. In 1986, the strategic calculus in Afghanistan shifted dramatically when the CIA began supplying Mujahideen forces with FIM-92 Stinger shoulder-launched surface-to-air missiles. The Stinger represented exactly the capability needed to counter the Hind. Infrared homing, fire-and-forget operation, range sufficient to engage helicopters before they could attack. The first confirmed Stinger kill of a Hind occurred in September 1986. Mujahideen fighters reported that the helicopter, struck by a Stinger shortly after takeoff, crashed with the loss of all aboard. Soviet forces responded with defensive measures: flare dispensers to decoy infrared missiles, exhaust deflectors to reduce heat signature, tactics changes emphasizing nap-of-earth flying and rapid terrain masking. Most significantly, increased standoff ranges, using longer-range weapons to attack from distances beyond Stinger range. The arms race between missile and helicopter continued throughout the remaining years of Soviet involvement in Afghanistan. But even the Stinger didn't render the Hind obsolete. Soviet forces adapted, accepting higher risk, using terrain more effectively, employing electronic countermeasures. The Hind remained the primary close air support platform through the Soviet withdrawal in 1989. Of approximately 360 helicopters lost by Soviet forces during the Afghanistan war, approximately 150 were Mi-24s. Considering the tens of thousands of sorties flown, the loss rate was actually lower than Western analysts had predicted. The Hind's armor and redundant systems meant that hits that would destroy Western helicopters often resulted in damaged but flyable Hinds returning to base. The most shocking development came from reports of Hinds engaging fixed-wing aircraft. On several occasions, Mi-24s encountered Afghan government or Pakistani aircraft and engaged using their cannons and even air-to-air missiles. While success rates were low, the mere fact that a helicopter could engage jets demonstrated capabilities Western doctrine said were impossible. The Hind's speed and agility, combined with Soviet pilots' aggressive tactics, allowed them to maneuver into firing positions that slower Western helicopters couldn't achieve. Western helicopter development responded to the Hind's capabilities. The AH-64 Apache, entering service in 1986, incorporated lessons learned from studying the Mi-24. Better armor protection, more powerful engines, greater weapons load. The Apache couldn't transport troops, showing that American designers still favored specialized aircraft over multi-role designs, but it incorporated the survivability and firepower concepts the Hind had demonstrated. European nations developed similar attack helicopters, all influenced by the recognition that the Hind had changed what attack helicopters needed to be. The Mi-24's influence extended beyond design to doctrine. NATO forces recognized that Soviet helicopter doctrine, which Western analysts had dismissed, was actually sophisticated and effective, using helicopters as primary assault weapons rather than support assets, integrating helicopter operations with ground maneuver, accepting helicopter losses as inevitable part of combined arms warfare. These concepts influenced how Western forces would use helicopters in future conflicts. The Hind proved itself beyond Afghanistan. In the Iran-Iraq War, Iraqi Mi-24s provided close air support that helped stabilize front lines after Iranian offensives. In various African conflicts, Hinds flown by government forces proved nearly invincible against rebel forces lacking sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons. In Chechnya during the 1990s, Russian Hinds operated in urban combat environments, demonstrating adaptability to missions far beyond the original design specifications. The aircraft's longevity demonstrated the soundness of its basic design. Production continued until the early 1990s with over 2,300 units built. In 2025, Mi-24s remain in service with dozens of nations, upgraded with modern avionics, weapons, and defensive systems. The basic airframe, designed in the late 1960s, proved adaptable enough to incorporate technologies that didn't exist when it was created. Modern Mi-24s feature digital cockpits, helmet-mounted displays, GPS navigation, and countermeasure systems, all integrated into an airframe nearly 60 years old. Western pilots who encountered the Hind in various conflicts developed respect bordering on admiration for the aircraft. American helicopter pilots who trained against captured or acquired Hinds reported that the aircraft was far more capable than its appearance suggested. The cockpit visibility was excellent. The controls were responsive despite the aircraft's size. The weapon systems, while less sophisticated than Western equivalents, were effective and reliable. Most significantly, the armor protection was genuinely impressive, allowing the Hind to operate in threat environments where Western helicopters would be too vulnerable. The legacy is visible in modern attack helicopter design. Every current attack helicopter incorporates armor protection, a lesson learned from the Hind. Most feature stub wings to offload the rotor at high speeds, directly borrowed from Soviet design. All carry substantial weapons, loads on external hardpoints. The specialized transport helicopter and specialized attack helicopter concept that Western forces favored has proven less flexible than the Hind's dual-role approach, leading to development of aircraft like the MH-60 direct-action penetrator that combine transport and attack capabilities. The Mi-24's cultural impact extended beyond military circles. The Hind became symbol of Soviet military power during the 1980s, appearing in films, novels, news coverage of Afghanistan. Its distinctive appearance, with the tandem cockpit giving it a predatory insect-like profile, made it instantly recognizable. For a generation that grew up during the final years of the Cold War, the Hind represented Soviet military technology in ways that tanks or jets never achieved. It was alien, threatening, undeniably effective. Soviet pilots who flew the Mi-24 in Afghanistan developed almost superstitious attachment to the aircraft. They knew its capabilities and limitations intimately. They trusted its armor to bring them home from missions that would be suicidal in less protected aircraft. They appreciated the power of its weapon systems, the confidence that came from knowing they could destroy any ground target they encountered. And they understood that Western pilots, who had initially laughed at the Hind, would never make that mistake again. The transformation of Western perception from mockery to respect took less than a decade. In the mid-1970s, NATO intelligence reports dismissed the Hind as impractical compromise. By the mid-1980s, those same reports analyzed the Hind as one of the most significant military aviation developments of the Cold War era. The aircraft forced Western nations to reconsider their helicopter doctrines, accelerate their attack helicopter programs, and develop countermeasures against capabilities they hadn't believed helicopters could possess. They called it a flying bus, too heavy and too slow, trying to do too much with one airframe. They laughed at its ungainly appearance, its massive fuselage, its backwards Soviet design philosophy that emphasized brute force over elegance. They calculated that its armor would make it too heavy to maneuver. Its weapons load would compromise its performance. Its dual role would mean it excelled at nothing. Then it fired its first rocket in combat. Then it survived hits that destroyed other helicopters. Then it transported troops directly into battle while providing its own fire support. Then it operated in conditions that grounded Western aircraft. Then it achieved speeds that Western attack helicopters couldn't match. Then it demonstrated survivability that Western helicopters couldn't achieve. And the laughter stopped, replaced by the recognition that Soviet engineers had created something genuinely revolutionary. An aircraft that changed how wars would be fought and how helicopters would be designed for generations to come. The Hind remains in service today, upgraded and still effective, still feared by those who face it, still respected by those who understand what it represented. It proved that unconventional design could work, that combining roles could create synergy rather than compromise, that survivability mattered as much as agility. It forced Western military aviation to evolve, to adapt, to recognize that Soviet engineering deserved respect rather than dismissal. In the end, the flying bus became the standard against which all attack helicopters would be measured, and everyone who had laughed learned the same lesson. Never underestimate what Soviet engineers could achieve when they ignored conventional wisdom and built what they believed would work.